Most people think secrets are protected by locks, passwords, and armed guards. That's not true. The real protection is silence, the kind that grows inside you after you understand what asking the wrong question costs. I kept that silence for 34 years. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former United States Air Force serviceman. I was never a scientist, never a strategist, never one of the men whose names appear in documentaries or congressional hearings. I was the kind of man the military trains very carefully, someone who follows instructions, keeps his head down, and understands that curiosity is not always a virtue. My job was simple: transport equipment, escort sealed containers, watch doors that were not supposed to open, and sometimes stand in a room where things happened that were never written down the way they actually occurred. People hear the name Area 51 and imagine hangars full of experimental aircraft, black triangles, strange engines, secret prototypes. Some of that is true, but the aircraft were never the part that kept men awake at night. The first time I realized that the place was not what the public believed happened in the winter of 1987. I wasn't stationed there permanently. Very few people were. Personnel rotated through in controlled assignments, short windows, limited exposure. You saw only the corridor you were cleared to walk. That night I was assigned to a security escort detail. Nothing unusual on paper. A small team, 3 airmen and 1 civilian technician whose badge color I had never seen before. We were told to accompany a transport cart from one secured section to another. No explanation, no manifest. Just the instruction every serviceman learns early in his career. Do not ask what you are moving. The cart was covered, thick black material, heavier than canvas. The kind used when someone doesn't want shapes visible underneath. I remember the sound first. Not mechanical, not animal. A faint vibration, like breath forced through something narrow. The technician walking with us heard it too. I saw his shoulders tense, but he kept walking. That's another thing people misunderstand about places like that. Everyone notices things. No one acknowledges them. The elevator took us down 2 levels I had never accessed before. The badge reader required both the technician's card and a code entered by one of the security officers waiting below. When the doors opened, the air felt different, colder, drier. The hallway lights were dimmer than the rest of the facility. Long strips of white illumination humming quietly above polished concrete floors. No windows, of course, just doors, heavy ones, each with small observation panels reinforced by thick glass. We moved past 3 of them. Behind the second door I saw movement, not clearly, just a shadow crossing the frosted panel. But shadows don't usually move like that, too slow, too deliberate. I remember wondering, not out of curiosity but instinct, whether I was looking at a person. The technician stopped in front of the last door. He swiped his badge, entered a code, and then he looked at me. Not the way officers usually look at enlisted men. This was different. He studied my face like he was measuring something. "You don't record what you see in here," he said quietly. It wasn't a warning. It sounded more like a fact. The door opened, and that's the moment my life quietly divided itself into 2 parts. The years before that room and everything that came after. Inside was a containment chamber surrounded by glass panels and medical equipment I couldn't identify. And in the center of it was something that should not have been there. Not an animal, not a person. Something else. Thin, pale. The proportions wrong in ways the mind struggles to process at first glance. Its arms were longer than a human's should be. Its head, larger, but not in the exaggerated way people draw in movies. The first thing I noticed were the eyes, closed, and the second thing I noticed was a camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, recording everything. That camera is the reason I'm speaking now, because decades later, I saw that footage again. And when I did, I realized something that had never occurred to me in 1987. The camera wasn't there to document the creature. It was there to document us, to record how we reacted, who hesitated, who looked too long, who asked questions they weren't supposed to ask. I didn't understand that at the time. Back then, I was just a young airman standing in a sealed room at a facility that officially did not exist, staring at something the world was never supposed to see. And the worst part? The thing inside the chamber wasn't dead. Not yet. I remember the moment its eyes opened, slowly, like it had been aware of us the entire time. And that was the first time in my life I realized something that no training manual had prepared me for. Whatever was inside that room was looking back at us with the same quiet awareness we were looking at it. And I still don't know which side of that glass was the containment, or which side was being studied. For years I told myself that memory had exaggerated what happened in that room. That's what people do when they carry something too heavy for too long. The mind softens the edges, rearranges details, turns impossible moments into something easier to live with. I convinced myself that what I saw was a medical experiment, a classified biological study, maybe something recovered from a crash, maybe even something engineered. There are many ways to explain away a moment if you give yourself enough time, and time was something I had plenty of. After that night in 1987, I was rotated out of the facility within 3 weeks. No explanation, no debrief beyond the usual security reminders, standard language. You did not see anything unusual. You were not present in any restricted biological containment environment. If questioned, you were performing routine equipment escort duties. Sign here. I signed, most of us did, and then we went back to ordinary assignments, carrying something we never spoke about. Years passed, the world changed. The Cold War ended. Technology moved faster than any of us could have imagined back then. But the silence stayed exactly the same. What people outside the military rarely understand is that secrecy doesn't end when you leave service. It follows you home, into your house, into your sleep, into the quiet moments when your mind drifts back to places it was never supposed to revisit. I built a normal life, or at least something that looked like one. Work, family, routine. But sometimes, late at night, I would remember the eyes opening behind that glass. Not hostile, not frightened, just aware, watching. I never told anyone about it, not because I was afraid of punishment. That part fades over time. I stayed silent because I didn't know what the truth actually was. And speaking about something you don't understand can destroy more than silence ever will. Then, 34 years later, the silence broke. Not by accident, by a file. It arrived through a channel I won't describe, from a man whose name I will never say. Someone who had been inside the system long enough to know how its shadows worked. The message was short. You were there. You deserved to see what they kept. Attached to it was a video file. No label, no date. Just a string of characters like every classified archive I'd ever seen. I almost didn't open it. Part of me knew exactly what it might be. The other part, the part that had lived with unanswered questions for 3 decades, needed to know. When the file started playing, the first thing I recognized was the room. Same glass walls, same medical equipment, same containment chamber. The camera angle matched the one mounted in the upper corner that night. It was the same recording system, but this footage was clearer than anything I had seen in person, because it wasn't filtered through memory. The timestamp in the corner read 2:14:09. 3 figures stood outside the chamber, 2 security personnel, 1 technician. I recognized one of the guards immediately, myself. Seeing your younger self on a recording like that is a strange experience. You expect to feel nostalgia, recognition. Instead, I felt distance. The man standing there in the uniform looked younger than I remembered, more certain, less tired. He didn't know what the next 30 years would do to him. The video showed exactly what I remembered. The cart, the technician entering codes, the chamber door sliding open. Then the camera adjusted focus, and the being inside the containment came into view. The footage didn't distort anything. If anything, it made the proportions even more unsettling. The body was thin, almost fragile looking. The skin carried a faint gray tone under the sterile lights. The limbs slightly longer than human anatomy would allow. But the most disturbing detail wasn't physical. It was the stillness. Creatures breathe, they twitch, they shift. This one remained almost perfectly motionless for several minutes, until the moment it opened its eyes. Watching the footage, I noticed something I had missed in the room that night. When the eyes opened, they didn't scan the chamber. They didn't wander. They locked directly onto the observation window, onto us, onto the camera. And then something happened that had never been mentioned in any report I signed. The technician spoke. I had no memory of that. Maybe the stress had erased it. Maybe I had been looking somewhere else. But the recording captured it clearly. He leaned toward the glass and said one sentence. Quiet, careful, almost respectful. Do you understand where you are? For a moment, nothing happened. Then the being moved its head slightly, not randomly, not like an injured animal. It turned slowly until its eyes were fixed directly on him. And the technician froze. You can see it in the footage. His body language changes instantly, like a man who suddenly realizes he's not observing something unconscious, but something aware enough to observe him back. The video ends 20 seconds later. No explanation, no report. Just the timestamp freezing on a frame where the being is still staring directly at the glass, at us, at the camera. When I finished watching, I sat there for a long time without moving. Not because the footage proved aliens existed, not because it confirmed conspiracy theories, but because it confirmed something much simpler and much more disturbing. The thing in that chamber wasn't behaving like an animal being studied. It behaved like something that knew exactly where it was and knew exactly who was watching. But the question that has haunted me ever since isn't what that being was. The question is something else. If that recording existed, how many others do you think there are? After I watched the video, I did something I hadn't done in more than 30 years. I pulled out the old box. Every serviceman keeps one. Sometimes it's medals, sometimes photographs, sometimes documents that officially aren't supposed to leave certain rooms, but somehow do. Mine sat in the back of a closet, wrapped in the same dull green cloth it had been stored in since the early 90s. Inside were the fragments of a life the Air Force once defined for me. Old identification cards, assignment patches, a photograph of a group of us standing in front of a transport vehicle somewhere in Nevada. The kind of photo that looks completely ordinary to anyone who wasn't there. But tucked underneath those things were 2 pages I had never thrown away. 2 pages that had bothered me for decades. They were copies of the escort report I signed the morning after that night in 1987. I remember the moment clearly. The room smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A civilian administrator sliding forms across a metal desk. He spoke in the same calm tone people use when they want something to feel routine. Standard documentation, confirmed transport escort, sign at the bottom. I didn't read it then. I was 23 years old, tired, and trained to understand that paperwork inside facilities like that is rarely optional. You sign, you leave, you forget. But years later I had read those pages, and what I found there had never made sense. The report described the escort of a sealed biological storage container from one sector of the facility to another. No mention of a containment chamber, no mention of observation glass. No mention of a technician speaking to anything inside. And most importantly, no mention of any living entity. Just a container, just equipment, just routine. That's how the system protects itself. Not by hiding events, by rewriting them. When you remove the words that describe something, eventually the event itself begins to fade. Paper becomes memory's replacement. And memory, well, memory can be questioned. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night, the report in one hand and the video paused on my laptop screen. 2 versions of the same night, one written, one recorded. Only one of them was allowed to exist. And that's when another memory came back to me. Not from the chamber, from earlier that evening. Before we reached the lower levels, we had passed through a security checkpoint staffed by a senior officer I had never seen before. His uniform carried no visible insignia except a small patch I didn't recognize. He studied each of us as we walked through. Not the way officers inspect troops, more like someone evaluating equipment. When it was my turn, he held my ID badge a second longer than necessary. Then he asked a question that seemed strange at the time. "You comfortable around biological material, Airman?" I remember answering the only way a young serviceman does when speaking to someone above his pay grade. "Yes, sir." He nodded once, handed the badge back, and that was it. At the time, it felt like nothing, but watching the footage decades later, that question took on a different weight. Because the thing inside that chamber wasn't inside a container when we arrived. It was already there, alive. Which means the escort mission described in the report was never the real assignment. We weren't escorting a container. We were escorting witnesses, making sure the right people saw what they were supposed to see, and making sure the record later said something else entirely. I watched the video again that night, slower this time, frame by frame. There's a moment right after the being opens its eyes when something subtle happens. Most people would miss it. The technician takes half a step back, not dramatic, just instinct. Like a man who suddenly realizes the distance between himself and the glass feels smaller than it did a second ago. But the being doesn't move. It doesn't try to escape. It doesn't show aggression. It simply watches, calm, observant, almost patient. And then the footage ends. For days after that, I kept asking myself the same question. Why send me that video now, after 3 decades of silence? The answer came in the form of another message, shorter than the first, just 1 sentence. That wasn't the only recording. No files attached, no explanation, just that line. And when I read it, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night inside that containment room. Not fear, something heavier. The realization that what I had seen in 1987 might not have been the beginning of anything. It might have been the middle, and if that's true, then the real question isn't what was inside that chamber. The real question is how long it had already been there before I walked into that room. Because creatures don't end up in underground facilities by accident. Someone had found it. Someone had brought it there, and someone had decided the world should never know. But there's one more part of that night the recording didn't show, something that happened after the camera stopped, something that has bothered me far more than the being itself. Because sometimes the most revealing moment isn't what happens in front of the camera, it's what people do the moment they believe the recording has ended. Most people believe the most important moments are the ones caught on film. That's what documentaries show, what investigations rely on, what courts consider evidence. But the system I spent part of my life inside learned something a long time ago. The camera doesn't have to miss the truth. It just has to stop recording before the truth begins. The video ends with the being staring through the glass, timestamp frozen, 2:14:29. What the footage doesn't show is what happened about 15 seconds later. because none of the cameras in that room were still running when it occurred. At least, none that we knew about. I remember the technician standing there, still staring at the chamber. His hands were clasped together in front of him, fingers tight enough that the knuckles had gone pale. No one spoke for a while, the kind of silence that feels thick in the air. You could hear the hum of the equipment around the containment platform, the quiet circulation of air through vents above us, the faint clicking of monitoring devices tracking something none of us fully understood. I was standing slightly behind the technician, close enough to see the reflection of the being's eyes in the glass. They hadn't blinked once. Then the technician did something unexpected. He spoke again, not loudly, not like someone addressing an animal or a patient. He spoke like someone addressing another person. "Can you hear me?" Still no reaction. The being continued to watch. And then, slowly, almost lazily, it moved one of its hands. I remember the motion clearly because it didn't look weak. It didn't look restrained. It looked deliberate. The hand rose slightly from the surface it had been resting on, long fingers extending in a way that felt oddly precise. Not a struggle, not a reflex, more like a gesture. The technician inhaled sharply. I heard it behind me. And that's when the room changed. Not physically, psychologically. There's a moment when everyone present realizes that the situation they thought they understood isn't the situation at all. The technician leaned closer to the glass. Too close. I remember thinking that even then. Security training teaches you distance, barriers, awareness. But he stepped right up to the observation panel. The being's eyes followed him the entire way. Not its head, just the eyes. And then it did something I still struggle to explain. The fingers that had lifted off the surface slowly curled inward and then extended again, once, twice, 3 times. The technician went completely still. If you've ever seen a person suddenly realize something terrifyingly clear, you know the look. It isn't panic, it's recognition. He whispered something under his breath that I didn't fully catch, but I remember 2 words: counting. Then he stepped back, slowly, like a man leaving the edge of something he had just discovered was far deeper than he thought. No alarm sounded, no containment breach occurred, nothing dramatic. The being simply lowered its hand again and resumed the same still position it had held before, watching, quiet, aware. A few minutes later, the chamber lights dimmed slightly, and the technician signaled that we were leaving. No explanation, no orders beyond the simple instruction we had followed since the beginning. Escort complete. We walked out of that room the same way we had entered it, silently. The hallway outside felt colder than before, or maybe it was just us. At the security desk upstairs, no one asked what we had seen. No one asked what had happened. The system doesn't work that way. If something needs to be discussed, someone tells you. If no one speaks, then the event officially never existed. The next morning I signed the report, the one that described a sealed biological container. Nothing more. I left the facility 3 weeks later, and for 34 years I convinced myself that whatever happened inside that chamber had ended there. But after seeing the recording again, after watching the moment when the being opened its eyes, after remembering the movement of those fingers against the surface of that containment platform, one thought has refused to leave my mind. The technician believed the being was counting, not randomly moving, not reacting, counting. Which means he believed something else, too. He believed the being understood numbers, patterns, sequence. And if that's true, then the thing we were watching inside that chamber wasn't confused. It wasn't disoriented. It wasn't even afraid. It was aware enough to communicate, just not in a language we expected. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and memory has nowhere left to hide, I find myself wondering something I never asked back then. If the being was counting, what exactly was it waiting for?